Yo, what's good fam? Real talk, have you ever felt so lonely that it literally changed who you are? Like, not just, I'm sad, lonely, but the kind that makes you question if you're even human? That's straight up what happened to Gaara from Naruto, and honestly, his story hits different when you break down the psychology behind it. We're talking about a kid, just a little boy, who became a literal killing machine because nobody, and I mean nobody, showed him love. The thumbnail says it all. The loneliness that turned a child into a deadly weapon. But here's the crazy part that most people miss. Gaara didn't want to be a monster. He was trying so hard to be loved that he ended up doing the exact opposite of what would get him that love. It's like this twisted psychological loop that trapped him, and bro, when you understand what was actually happening in his mind, it's absolutely heartbreaking. This isn't just some anime character analysis. This is real psychological trauma playing out in front of us, and it explains why so many of us connect with Gaara on such a deep level. Stick around because what I'm about to break down will completely change how you see loneliness, attachment, and what happens when a child's basic emotional needs get totally ignored. Before we dive deep into Gaara's psychological breakdown, do me a solid real quick, smash that subscribe button and drop a like on this video. Here's why you absolutely can't miss out. If you've ever felt misunderstood, if you've ever wondered why some people push others away when they need connection the most, or if you just want to understand the insane psychology hidden in your favorite anime characters, this channel is literally your new home. We break down the mental health and psychology of anime in ways that actually make sense and hit close to home. Plus, understanding Gaara's journey might just help you understand yourself or someone you care about better. So yeah, subscribe and let's keep this conversation going, fam. Alright, let's get into the psychological deep end, because Gaara's story is basically a textbook case of what psychologists call attachment trauma, mixed with some seriously messed up conditioning. So picture this, you're born, right? And from day one, literally from the moment you take your first breath, you're supposed to feel safe. Your parents are supposed to hold you, protect you, make you feel like you matter. That's how humans are wired. We need that connection to develop normally. It's not optional, it's biological. But Gaara? Nah man, he got the complete opposite. His own father, the Kazekage, the leader of the whole village, ordered his assassination multiple times. Let that sink in for a second. Your own dad, the person who's supposed to protect you more than anyone else in the world, is actively trying to kill you. That's not just rejection, bro, that's existential level betrayal. And here's where the psychology gets really intense. Gaara's mind had to make sense of this somehow. Kids' brains are like sponges, right? They're constantly trying to figure out the rules of the world, trying to understand, how do I survive here? And when you're a child, you can't comprehend that your parents might be wrong or cruel. Instead, you internalize it. You think, if my dad wants me dead, I must be bad. If everyone fears me, I must be a monster. This is what psychologists call internalized shame, and it's deadass one of the most damaging things that can happen to a developing mind. Gaara didn't just feel lonely, he felt fundamentally unlovable, like something was wrong with him at his core. And yo, this is where it gets even darker. He had Shikaku, the one-tailed beast, sealed inside him, which meant he literally couldn't sleep. Think about that for a minute. Never sleeping means never getting a break from your own thoughts, never getting that reset that sleep gives your brain. It's like being trapped in your own head 24/7 with no escape, and all those thoughts are telling you that you're a monster, that you're dangerous, that nobody will ever love you. So here's what happens psychologically when a kid experiences this level of rejection and isolation. Their nervous system goes into permanent survival mode. There's this concept in psychology called the fight, flight, or freeze response, right? It's your body's automatic reaction to danger. But for Gaara, there was no safety to return to. Most kids, even if they have a scary experience, can run home to mom and dad and feel safe again. That safety allows their nervous system to calm down and return to normal. But Gaara's home was the source of danger. His dad wanted him dead. The village feared him. Even his uncle Yashimaru, the one person he thought cared about him, tried to kill him and told him his mother never loved him before dying. Let me break down what that moment with Yashimaru did to Gaara's psyche, because this is crucial. Up until that assassination attempt, Gaara had this tiny, fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, someone out there cared about him. Yashimaru represented his last connection to the possibility of love. When Yashimaru not only tried to kill him but also told him that his mother cursed the village and hated him before dying, that destroyed the last piece of hope Gaara was holding onto. In psychological terms, this is called a core wound. A traumatic experience so deep that it fundamentally shapes how you see yourself in the world forever. What's really messed up is that Gaara tried so hard to connect with people before all this went down. Remember those flashbacks of little Gaara trying to play with other kids? trying to help them? He wanted so badly to be normal, to be accepted, to be loved. But his sand, the automatic defense mechanism from Shikaku, would hurt people who got too close, even when Gaara didn't want it to. So he's stuck in this impossible situation. He desperately wants connection, but his very existence seems to hurt people. It's like if every time you tried to hug someone, you accidentally shocked them with electricity. Eventually you'd stop trying to hug people, right? You'd start believing that you're meant to be alone. This created what psychologists call a self-fulfilling prophecy. Gaara started believing he was a monster, so he started acting like one. He carved that kanji for love into his forehead, and the symbolism there is insane when you think about it psychologically. He literally branded himself with the thing he wanted most but could never have. It's like he was trying to remind himself of what he was missing, or maybe trying to claim it by force since nobody would give it to him freely. And the blood he used? That's his way of saying, this is my identity now, love and pain are the same thing to me. Here's where we gotta talk about reactive attachment disorder. It's a real psychological condition that happens when kids don't form healthy attachments with caregivers early in life. The symptoms? Difficulty trusting others, being emotionally withdrawn, being unable to seek comfort, and sometimes showing aggressive or destructive behaviors. Sound familiar? That's literally Gaara's entire personality before meeting Naruto. He couldn't trust anyone because everyone who was supposed to love him had hurt him. He was emotionally shut down because opening up had only brought him pain. And he became aggressive and destructive because that was the only way his nervous system knew how to protect him from more hurt. But here's the thing that makes Gaara's psychology so relatable, even though most of us haven't been literal ninja weapons, that core fear of being unlovable? That's universal, man. Maybe you weren't hunted by your own village, but maybe you felt excluded in school. Maybe your parents were emotionally unavailable. Maybe you felt like you had to hide parts of yourself to be accepted. That same psychological wound, feeling like, if people really knew me they wouldn't love me, that's something so many of us carry. Gaara just represents the extreme end of that spectrum, which is why his character hits so hard. The sand that automatically protects him is such a perfect metaphor for psychological defense mechanisms. In real life, we build walls around our hearts. We push people away before they can reject us. We act tough so nobody knows we're hurting. We convince ourselves we don't need anyone so it won't hurt when we're alone. Gaara's sand is doing that literally. It's protecting him from physical harm, sure, but it's also keeping everyone at a distance, making sure nobody can get close enough to hurt him emotionally again. The tragedy is that the same mechanism protecting him from pain is also preventing him from ever experiencing the love he's desperate for. And can we talk about how Gaara's insomnia plays into this? Sleep isn't just about physical rest. It's when your brain processes emotions and memories, when it sorts through everything that happened during the day and files it away properly. Without sleep, traumatic memories stay raw and unprocessed. They stay in your active consciousness instead of being archived as things that happened in the past. So for Gaara, every painful memory was always present, always fresh, always hurting him like it just happened. He was living in a constant state of re-traumatization, never getting a break from his own pain. This is why Gaara's eyes are so haunting, right? That black around his eyes isn't just from lack of sleep. Symbolically, it represents the darkness of his psychological state, the burden of trauma that's literally written on his face. He can't hide what he's been through. It's visible to everyone, which makes him even more isolated because people can see there's something wrong with him before they even talk to him. It's like carrying a sign that says, "Damaged," everywhere you go. The psychological concept of learned helplessness also applies here. When you experience repeated trauma that you can't control or escape, your brain eventually learns that trying to change your situation is pointless. So you stop trying. Gaara stopped trying to be loved and started embracing being feared instead, because at least fear was something he could control. If people were going to react to him negatively anyway, he might as well make it on his terms. It's a survival strategy, but it's also a prison. So we've established that Gaara's psychological foundation was completely shattered from day one, right? But now let's talk about what that actually does to a person's internal world. Like, what's happening inside their mind and soul when they're living with this level of trauma. Because Gaara didn't just become mean or withdrawn. Dude had a complete psychological collapse that transformed his entire sense of identity. There's this concept in psychology called identity formation, which basically means the process of figuring out who you are as a person. For most people, this happens gradually through childhood and adolescence. You try different things, you get feedback from people you trust, you figure out what you're good at, what you value, what makes you, you. But for that to work in a healthy way, you need a stable foundation. You need to feel safe, you need to feel valued, You need to have people who reflect back to you that you're worthy of existing. Gaara had none of that. Instead, the only consistent feedback he got from the world was, "You're dangerous, you're a monster, you shouldn't exist." So that became his identity. Not because he wanted it to be, but because when everyone around you is telling you the same thing, especially as a kid, you start to believe it. It's called mirroring in psychology. We learn who we are by seeing ourselves reflected in how others treat us. And every single person in Gaara's life reflected back to him that he was something to be feared and destroyed. Here's where it gets really psychological though. Gaara didn't just accept being a monster, he weaponized it. There's this defense mechanism called identification with the aggressor, where trauma victims sometimes adopt the characteristics or behaviors of their abusers as a way to feel less powerless. Gaara was a victim of violence, so he became violent. He was treated as inhuman, so he stopped trying to be human. It's like his mind said, "Okay, if I can't beat this, I'll become it." That way, at least he has some control over the situation, you know? But here's the really tragic part that most people miss. Even when Gaara was at his most violent, killing people without hesitation, he was still operating from that same core wound of wanting to be acknowledged. He literally says his whole philosophy becomes, "I fight only for myself and love only myself." But that's not actually self-love, bro. That's isolation dressed up as strength. Real self-love is when you genuinely value yourself and can also connect with others. What Gaara's doing is more like, if I pretend I only need myself, then it won't hurt so much that nobody else wants me. It's a psychological shield, not actual self-sufficiency. There's a really important distinction here between solitude and loneliness. Solitude is when you choose to be alone and it feels peaceful. It's restorative, it's something you want. Loneliness is when you're disconnected from others and it feels painful. It's depleting, it's something you're trapped in. Gaara wasn't choosing solitude. He was drowning in loneliness while pretending he chose it. And that pretense? That's exhausting, man. It takes so much psychological energy to maintain that facade of, "I don't need anyone," when your whole soul is screaming for connection. Let's talk about what the Chunin exams represented psychologically for Gaara. This is where we really see his internal collapse on full display. He's not just fighting in battles, he's actively seeking out violence as a way to prove his existence matters. There's this line he says about how killing people who are trying to survive and love others proves that his existence has meaning. Pause and think about how twisted that logic is, but also how it makes perfect sense from his damaged psychological perspective. What he's essentially saying is, if I can destroy the thing I can't have, love and connection, then at least I'm powerful. At least I matter in some way. It's like if you really wanted to be a musician but everyone told you that you had no talent, so instead you went around breaking other people's instruments to prove that you could still affect the world of music somehow. It's a desperate attempt to matter, to have an impact, to prove you exist. But it's through destruction instead of creation, because creation, building relationships, building love, was taken away from him. The fight with Sasuke during the Chunin exams is super important psychologically because it's the first time in forever that Gaara feels genuinely threatened. Up until that point, his sand had protected him from everything. He'd never been hurt. And on the surface, you'd think that's a good thing, right? But psychologically, it actually reinforced his isolation. Pain is a form of connection in a weird way. It's proof that you're vulnerable, that you're human, that other people can affect you. Gaara's absolute defense meant he was literally untouchable, which is another way of saying he was unreachable. When Sasuke's Chidori actually breaks through and hurts him, Gaara completely loses it. But it's not just because he's in physical pain, it's because his entire sense of identity just got shattered. His whole identity was built on being invincible, on being a monster that nothing could touch. That was his protection, not just physically but psychologically. If he wasn't the untouchable monster, then who was he? If his sand couldn't protect him absolutely, then what did he have? It triggered this massive identity crisis right in the middle of battle. This is where we see Shikaku taking more control, which symbolically represents Gaara losing control of himself when his psychological defenses fail. In psychology, we call this decompensation. It's when your coping mechanisms stop working and you kind of fall apart. Gaara had been using violence and isolation as coping mechanisms, and when those failed, when he got hurt despite his sand, when he felt fear, his psyche couldn't handle it. The monster inside him, trauma, rage, pain, that he'd been barely containing just burst out. The transformation into Shikaku is such a powerful metaphor for what unprocessed trauma does to people. When you're holding in that much pain, that much rage, that much hurt, it doesn't just disappear. It builds up inside you, and eventually, if you don't deal with it in healthy ways, it explodes. It takes control. You become your trauma instead of a person who experienced trauma. That's what was happening to Gaara. The traumatized, hurt little boy was being completely consumed by the monster that trauma had created. Now let's talk about the encounter with Naruto during this fight, because this is where things start to shift, but not in the way people might think. Naruto seeing through Gaara's facade didn't instantly fix him. Real psychological healing doesn't work like that. But what it did do was plant a seed of possibility. For the first time, someone looked at Gaara and saw the hurt underneath the monster. Naruto recognized the loneliness because he'd experienced it himself. And that recognition, being truly seen by another person, that's powerful, man. There's a concept in therapy called witnessing, where healing begins when someone truly acknowledges your pain without judgment. Naruto did that for Gaara. He didn't excuse Gaara's violence, but he understood where it came from. He saw the scared, lonely kid underneath all that rage. And for someone who's never been truly seen before, who's only ever been feared or hated, being understood even a little bit can crack open something inside you. But here's the psychological reality that's important to understand. That moment didn't heal Gaara. It just showed him that healing was possible, that maybe he wasn't as fundamentally broken and unlovable as he'd believed his entire life. The real work, the real psychological transformation that had to come later. What Naruto did was challenge Gaara's core belief system. Gaara's whole identity was built on, I am alone, I will always be alone, therefore I must be a monster. Naruto showed up with the same loneliness but a different response to it, which made Gaara question everything. This is what psychologists call cognitive dissonance. When you encounter information that contradicts your deeply held beliefs, and your mind has to reconcile that somehow. Gaara believed that loneliness inevitably made you a monster. But here's Naruto, who experienced similar rejection and loneliness, and he's not a monster. He's still trying to connect with people. He still has hope. That doesn't compute with Gaara's worldview, and cognitive dissonance is uncomfortable, man. It forces you to either reject the new information or reconsider your beliefs. For Gaara, this started an internal collapse of a different kind, not the collapse into more darkness, but the collapse of the false identity he built to protect himself. That's terrifying in its own way, because if you're not the monster you've been telling yourself you are, then who are you? If your pain and isolation don't define you, what does? Identity crises are rough, especially when your entire sense of self has been built on trauma. There's also this element of shame that we need to talk about. As Gaara started to realize that maybe, just maybe, there was another way to exist in the world, he also had to confront what he'd done. All the people he'd killed, all the pain he'd caused, he did that stuff while believing it was the only way, but now that belief is being challenged. That brings up massive amounts of guilt and shame, which are incredibly difficult emotions to process. It's easier to stay in the identity of, I'm a monster and monsters do monstrous things, than to face, I'm a person who did monstrous things because I was hurt and didn't know any other way. The psychological journey from victim to survivor to thriver is messy, man. It's not linear. Gaara didn't have some instant enlightenment and become whole again. He had a moment of recognition that started a long, painful process of reconstructing his identity and learning how to be human instead of a weapon. And that process, that's what makes his character arc so psychologically realistic and powerful. Yo, real quick, what are you thinking so far? Drop a comment and let me know. Have you ever felt like Gaara, even just a little bit? Maybe not the killing part, obviously, but that feeling of being fundamentally alone, or feeling like you have to protect yourself from everyone. Do you know someone who's been through something like this? Someone who pushes people away because they're scared of getting hurt? Share your story in the comments, fam. Your experience matters, and honestly, talking about this stuff helps all of us feel less alone. Plus, it really helps me keep bringing you content like this, so let's keep this conversation going. And yo, stick with me till the end of this video, because we're about to get into the moment that changed everything for Gaara. The point where he either had to choose to stay in darkness forever or take the scariest step of his life. Trust me, you don't want to miss how this plays out psychologically. Alright, so we've broken down how Gaara got to this dark place and what was happening in his mind when everything started crumbling. Now let's talk about the psychological point of no return. That moment when someone who's been drowning in trauma either goes completely under or makes the choice to swim toward the surface. For Gaara, this moment came after his defeat and conversation with Naruto, and what happened next is some of the most psychologically complex character development in anime, real talk. Here's what people don't always understand about trauma recovery. There's this crucial moment where you have to decide if you're willing to be vulnerable again. After you've been hurt so badly that you built an entire fortress around your heart, choosing to let those walls down is terrifying. It's not brave in the Hollywood movie sense. It's terrifying in the, every fiber of my being is screaming that this will destroy me sense. For Gaara, this meant confronting the possibility that maybe connection was worth the risk of pain. The psychological concept here is what therapists call post-traumatic growth. It's this idea that sometimes after experiencing severe trauma, people can actually develop in positive ways, but only if they're willing to process the trauma instead of just surviving it. Gaara had been in survival mode his entire life. His sand was survival. His violence was survival. His isolation was survival. But survival isn't the same as living, you know what I'm saying? What Naruto showed Gaara was that you could acknowledge your pain, carry your trauma, and still choose connection. That's revolutionary for someone whose entire existence had been defined by protect yourself at all costs because nobody else will. The psychological shift here is from the world is dangerous and I must be dangerous to survive it, to the world is dangerous but maybe I don't have to face it alone. That's a massive reframing of reality, and it doesn't happen overnight. Let's talk about what happened when Gaara went back to the Sand Village after this revelation. This is where we see the real psychological work beginning. He didn't magically become a different person. Trauma doesn't work like that. You don't just decide to heal and boom, you're healed. Instead, we see him struggling with who he is versus who he's been versus who he might become. That internal conflict? That's what real psychological change looks like. There's this concept in psychology called neuroplasticity. Your brain's ability to form new neural pathways and change throughout your life. Gaara had spent his entire childhood building neural pathways associated with threat, violence, and isolation. Every experience reinforced those pathways, making them stronger and more automatic. Now he's trying to build new pathways, ones associated with trust, connection, and vulnerability. But those old pathways don't just disappear. They're still there, still strong, still pulling him back toward old patterns. This is why Gaara's journey is so realistic psychologically. He doesn't become sunshine and rainbows after talking to Naruto. He becomes someone who's actively fighting against his own conditioning every single day. When we see him later as Kazekage, we're seeing someone who's chosen to protect people instead of hurt them. But you can tell it's a choice he has to keep making, not something that comes naturally yet. That's recovery in real life, man. It's choosing the harder path over and over until eventually it gets a little easier. The relationship with his siblings is super important here from a psychological perspective. Temari and Kankuro were terrified of him for years and rightfully so. But they also never completely abandoned him even when they were scared. They represented this tiny thread of potential connection that Gaara had ignored because connection meant vulnerability. When he started opening up to the possibility of relationships, he had to start with them, and that meant acknowledging how his trauma had hurt them too. This brings up a really important psychological reality. When you're healing from trauma, you often have to confront how your pain affected others. That's incredibly difficult because you're simultaneously trying to be compassionate with yourself, recognizing you were hurt and did what you could to survive, while also taking responsibility for harm you caused. It's a delicate balance. Gaara had to hold both truths at once. He was a victim of horrific abuse and he had victimized others. Both things are true. The decision to become Kazekage is psychologically fascinating because it represents Gaara choosing to find meaning in his pain. There's this concept in existential psychology that suffering becomes bearable when you can find meaning in it. Gaara's suffering was meaningless when he was just surviving, just killing, just existing in isolation. But when he chose to use his strength to protect the village that had rejected him, that gave his pain purpose. It transformed his trauma from something that happened to him into something he could use for others. But let's be real, that's also complicated psychologically. Because part of his decision to protect the village was still connected to wanting acceptance, wanting to prove his worth, wanting to finally be loved by the people who had feared him. And that's okay actually. Motivations for healing are rarely pure. Most of us do the hard work of recovery partly for ourselves and partly because we want others to see us differently. Gaara was no different. He wanted to be acknowledged, to be valued, to finally receive the love he'd always craved. Using that desire to fuel positive action instead of destructive action? That's actually healthy psychology. There's this moment in Shippuden where Gaara is fighting to protect the village from Deidara, and he's willing to sacrifice himself. From a psychological standpoint, this shows how far he's come, from someone who only valued his own existence, even though that valuation was twisted and based on destruction, to someone who values others enough to die for them. But it also shows he still hasn't fully internalized his own worth separate from his usefulness. He's still trying to earn love through sacrifice, which is a pattern common in people with attachment trauma. When Gaara gets kidnapped and killed by the Akatsuki, and then Naruto comes to save him and brings him back to life. Bro, the psychological symbolism there is intense. Naruto literally brings him back from death, which represents how connection and love can resurrect parts of yourself that trauma killed. But more importantly, Gaara wakes up to an entire village grieving for him, fighting for him, wanting him back. For someone who spent his whole life believing nobody would care if he died, waking up to find out that your death mattered to people? That's psychologically transformative. This is where we see a shift in Gaara's core belief system. That fundamental belief of "I am alone and unlovable" starts to crack and crumble because the evidence is right in front of him. The village mourned him. Naruto risked everything to save him. His siblings were devastated. The old belief system can't survive when reality directly contradicts it this powerfully. In psychological terms, this is where cognitive restructuring happens, where old harmful beliefs get replaced with new healthier ones based on new evidence. But here's what's crucial to understand. This doesn't erase the trauma. Gaara will always carry the scars of his childhood. The difference is that now he has evidence that those scars don't define his worth. He has relationships that prove connection is possible. He has a community that reflects back to him that he matters, not because of what he can do for them, but because of who he is. That's what healthy psychological development looks like after trauma. Not forgetting the past, but learning to carry it without letting it control your future. The psychological concept of earned secure attachment applies here. Even though Gaara didn't get secure attachment as a child, which is the foundation of healthy psychological development, he's earning it now as a young adult through his relationships with Naruto, his siblings, and his village. Research shows that it's never too late to develop secure attachment. It's harder when you didn't have it as a kid, and you have to be more intentional about it, but it's possible. Gaara is living proof of that. There's also this interesting shift in how Gaara relates to his power. The sand that used to represent his isolation and his trauma becomes something he uses to protect others. Same power, completely different meaning. This is what psychologists call sublimation. Taking energy from difficult or negative experiences and channeling it into positive actions. Gaara's not pretending his trauma didn't happen or that it didn't shape him. Instead, he's taking what trauma gave him, strength, resilience, understanding of suffering, and using it to help others. When Gaara speaks at the 5 Kage Summit and later during the war, we see him using his story to inspire others. He's open about his pain, about his loneliness, about his transformation. That's incredibly psychologically healthy because he's not hiding his trauma and shame anymore. He's integrated it into his identity in a way that acknowledges, yes, this happened to me and it was terrible, but it doesn't make me less worthy. That kind of self-acceptance after trauma is the goal of most therapy work. The relationship between Gaara and Naruto specifically represents something psychologically called corrective emotional experience. This is when a new relationship provides a different, healthier interaction pattern than what you experienced in the past, and it helps rewire your expectations about relationships. Every time Naruto shows up for Gaara, believes in him, sees the good in him, it's counteracting all those years of rejection and fear. It's teaching Gaara's nervous system that maybe people can be safe, maybe connection doesn't always end in pain. What makes Gaara's arc so powerful psychologically is that it doesn't happen quickly or easily. We see him struggle. We see him still sometimes defaulting to isolation when he's stressed. We see him having to consciously choose trust over suspicion, connection over safety. That's realistic trauma recovery. It's not linear, it's not simple, and it's not complete. But it's possible, and that's what gives people hope when they see themselves in Gaara's story. The point of no return for Gaara wasn't the conversation with Naruto. That was just the beginning. The point of no return was when he actively chose, over and over again, to build a different life than what his trauma had prepared him for. When he chose to be Kazekage knowing he'd have to be vulnerable. When he chose to trust his siblings even though trust had always hurt him before. When he chose to keep believing in connection even when his brain was screaming that isolation was safer. Those choices, made repeatedly over time, that's what created lasting psychological change. So here's the thing about Gaara's story that hits different when you really understand the psychology behind it. The scars never completely heal. And honestly, that's the most real, most hopeful part of his entire arc. Let me explain why that's not depressing but actually incredibly important for anyone dealing with their own trauma or loneliness. See, in most stories the hero overcomes their trauma and then they're just fixed, like it never happened. But that's not how psychology works in real life, and it's not how it works for Gaara either. Even after he becomes Kazekage, even after he forms genuine connections with people, even after he proves to himself that he's loved and valued, he still carries what happened to him. That's visible in how he interacts with the world, in his moments of hesitation, in the way he sometimes still defaults to handling things alone before remembering he has people he can rely on. There's this concept in trauma psychology called integration versus resolution. Resolution would mean the trauma is over, done, healed completely. But that's rarely how it works with severe childhood trauma. Integration means you've incorporated the traumatic experiences into your life story in a way that acknowledges they happened, recognizes how they shaped you, but doesn't let them control your present. Gaara achieves integration, not resolution. The trauma is part of who he is, but it's not all of who he is anymore. This is mad important for people watching Gaara's story and relating to their own experiences. If you've been through serious trauma or serious loneliness, you might be waiting for the day when you're fixed, when it doesn't affect you anymore. But that's not a realistic or helpful goal. The real goal is to get to a place where you can acknowledge your pain, carry your scars, and still build a meaningful life. That's what Gaara does. He doesn't pretend his childhood didn't happen. He doesn't act like he's not still affected by it. He just refuses to let it be the only thing that defines him. Let's talk about what this looks like practically in Gaara's character. When he's under extreme stress during the war arc, we can see some of his old patterns trying to resurface. There are moments where his first instinct is still to handle threats with overwhelming force, where his face shows that same cold expression from his childhood. But now he has tools to recognize those patterns and make different choices. That's what healing looks like, not the absence of triggers or difficult moments, but having the skills to navigate them differently. The psychological term for this is emotional regulation. For most of Gaara's childhood, he had no emotional regulation skills. He went from zero to murder real quick because he never learned how to handle his emotions in healthier ways. Nobody taught him. Nobody modeled it for him. He was basically operating with the emotional regulation skills of a toddler while having the power to level cities. As he heals and grows, we see him developing better emotional regulation. He can feel anger without immediately acting on it. He can feel fear without completely shutting down or lashing out. That's massive psychological growth. But here's what's crucial. Even with those new skills, the old patterns don't disappear. They're still there in his brain, those old neural pathways that were built through years of trauma and survival. They're just not the only option anymore. There are new pathways now, healthier ones, and with practice, those become stronger. But the old ones remain, especially under stress. That's not failure, that's just how brains work. Understanding this can be really freeing for people because it means you're not broken if you still struggle sometimes. You're just human. There's something really powerful in how Gaara's relationships evolve over time that speaks to long-term trauma recovery. His friendship with Naruto doesn't fix him, but it gives him a reference point for what healthy connection looks like. His relationship with his siblings doesn't erase the years they spent afraid of him, but it shows that relationships can be repaired and rebuilt with time and effort. His role as Kazekage doesn't validate his worth, because his worth isn't conditional, but it gives him purpose and proves to him that he can use his strength for protection instead of destruction. What's psychologically fascinating is that Gaara has to learn things that most people learn naturally as children. How to trust. How to ask for help. How to accept care from others. How to express emotions in healthy ways. How to believe you're worthy of love. Most kids learn this stuff through secure attachments with caregivers, but Gaara's learning it in his teens and early 20s. That's harder, more conscious work. He has to deliberately practice things that come naturally to people who had healthy childhoods. And you can see that in how he sometimes seems a bit awkward or uncertain in emotional situations. He's literally learning a new language of connection. The scar on his psyche, that deep wound of, I was alone and unloved when I needed love most, that's always there. But scars are interesting things psychologically. At first, they're painful and sensitive. Touch them and it hurts. Over time, with proper healing, they become less sensitive. They're still there, still visible, but they don't hurt the same way. That's Gaara's journey. The scar of his childhood is permanent, but it doesn't cause him constant, acute pain anymore. It's integrated into who he is. Here's where the invisible cliffhanger comes in, and why Gaara's story is never really finished. Because psychological healing isn't a destination, it's a lifelong process. Every new relationship Gaara forms, he's still working through those attachment issues. Every time he has to trust someone, that's still a conscious choice against his old programming. Every time he chooses vulnerability over self-protection, that's still hard for him in ways it might not be for someone who didn't experience his trauma. The work doesn't end just because he's better. And that's actually the most hopeful message in his entire story. You don't have to be completely healed to have a meaningful life. You don't have to have all your trauma resolved to be worthy of love. You don't have to be perfect or fixed to make a difference in the world. Gaara is still carrying his scars, still sometimes struggling with the aftereffects of his trauma, but he's also the Kazekage. He's protecting thousands of people. He has deep, meaningful relationships. He's living proof that you can be still healing and thriving at the same time. There's this concept in psychology called both/ and thinking versus either/ or thinking. Either/ or thinking says, I'm either healed or I'm broken. Both/ and thinking says, I can be healing and still struggling sometimes. I can be strong and still need support. I can be successful and still affected by my past. Gaara embodies both/ and thinking. He's both the powerful Kazekage and the lonely kid who was desperate for love. He's both the person who did terrible things and the person working every day to be better. He's both scarred by his past and building a better future. All of those things are true simultaneously. What makes his character arc so psychologically resonant is that it mirrors real recovery. In the beginning, you're drowning in your trauma and it controls everything. Then you have a moment of realization that maybe things could be different. Then comes the really hard work of actually changing your patterns and beliefs. Then you start seeing progress, but you also have setbacks. Then eventually, you get to a place where your trauma is part of your story but not your whole story. That's where Gaara lands, and that's where most people in recovery land too. The relationship between Gaara and the younger generation of ninja is psychologically significant because it shows him breaking the cycle. He could have perpetuated the trauma, could have been cold or harsh, or created more lonely kids like he was. Instead, he's protective, supportive, and understanding. When he interacts with other Jinchuriki, he gets it in a way nobody else does. He uses his experience to help others avoid his pain. That's what psychologists call post-traumatic growth in action. Taking your worst experiences and using them to create positive change for others. But let's keep it real. Even in those moments where he's helping others, you can sometimes see the shadow of his past cross his face. A moment where he remembers. A flash of that old pain. And that's okay. That's realistic. You don't forget trauma just because you've healed from it. You don't stop being affected by it just because you've learned to manage it better. The goal isn't to erase the past, it's to stop letting the past erase your future. Here's the thing that hits hardest about Gaara's psychology: he represents every person who's ever felt fundamentally alone. Not just, I don't have plans tonight, alone, but, something about me is unlovable, alone. That existential loneliness that makes you question your worth as a human being. So many people carry that wound, maybe not to Gaara's extreme, but they carry it. And watching him move through that, watching him find connection without pretending the wound never existed, that's powerful medicine for people with similar scars. The invisible cliffhanger in Gaara's story is this: we never see him completely healed because that's not a real thing. What we see is him continuously choosing growth, continuously choosing connection, continuously choosing to believe in the possibility of love even when his entire childhood taught him that love was impossible. Every day is a choice. Every relationship is a risk. Every moment of vulnerability is an act of courage. And that never stops being true, even when you're the Kazekage, even when you have people who love you, even when you've made it. That's the scar that doesn't close. Not because it's still bleeding, but because it's a permanent part of who you are. And maybe that's okay. Maybe our scars are proof that we survived. Maybe they're roadmaps showing us where we've been and reminding us why we keep fighting to stay in the light instead of falling back into darkness. Gaara's scars, psychological and physical, they tell his story. They're not something to be ashamed of or hide. They're evidence of his journey. So where does that leave us with Gaara? He's not cured. He's not over it. He's not the same as someone who never experienced that trauma. But he's alive. He's connected. He's loved. He's making a difference. He's proving every single day that your worst moments don't have to define your entire life. That loneliness doesn't have to be permanent. That you can be shaped by trauma without being destroyed by it. And honestly, that's a better, more hopeful message than, and then he was totally fine, could ever be. Yo, so if Gaara's story hit you in the feels like it did for me, you absolutely need to check out our next video where we break down another character whose psychology is absolutely insane. We're talking about someone whose trauma manifests in a completely different way, but it's just as real and just as relatable. Look fam, here's the deal. Understanding these characters isn't just about anime. It's about understanding ourselves, understanding the people around us, and realizing that we're all carrying something. The more we talk about this stuff, the more we break down the psychology behind why people do what they do, the more we can have compassion for ourselves and others. This channel is literally a community of people who get it, people who see themselves in these characters, who want to understand the deeper psychological truths in the stories we love, and who aren't afraid to have real conversations about mental health, trauma, and healing. You're not just watching videos here, you're part of something bigger. So smash that next video, Keep this journey going with me, and let's continue exploring the psychology of the characters that shaped us. Trust me, once you start seeing anime through this psychological lens, you can never go back, and you won't want to. The next character we're breaking down? Their story is gonna blow your mind even more than Gaara's did. Let's go.